When Rodrigo Duterte was elected president of the Philippines in 2016, he championed himself as anti-establishment and swore to bring a violent end to drugs in the Philippines. Duterte had always carried a strong distaste for drugs and drug dealers in Filipino society. Prior to ascending to the presidency, he had been the mayor of Davos, a major Filipino city, for 2 decades where he had devoted much of his time to combating drug-related crime. However, Duterte's tactics of choice have never been as simple as incarceration and rehabilitation. Rather, Duterte was a large proponent of capital punishment, or in this case, the extrajudicial killings of drug dealers and drug users. Prior to the war on drugs, the United Nations ranked the Philippines as having the highest rate of methamphetamine usage in East Asia. In numbers, 2.2% of Filipinos between the ages of 16 and 64 were estimated to be using methamphetamine or marijuana. The history of drug addiction in the Philippines expanded long before Duterte, going as far back as to the Spanish colonization of the Philippines in the 1500s. Back then, Filipinos struggled with opium addiction before their new colonizers, the Americans, banned the substance in all instances except for medical usage. But by the 1940s, coca, marijuana, and hemp were all introduced to the Philippines. All of this to say, drug addiction was not a new phenomenon in Filipino society. Neither was the violent suppression tactics against said addiction. Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos had launched his own war on drugs in the 1970s with American funding. In Duterte's point of view, the perpetual drug addiction problem in the Philippines put a damper on economic growth and national prosperity. Duterte's war on drugs begins in 2016. During the war, executions were carried out by a mix of government agencies and vigilante groups. Duterte himself encouraged Filipino civilians to join in the fight against drugs, encouraging them to kill drug pushers themselves. Some civilians, empowered by Duterte's rhetoric, actually did commit murder for the drug war. The Filipino government typically called those individuals vigilantes. Aside from the vigilantes, law enforcement was also active in killing drug lords and addicts. These officers had always claimed that they acted strictly in self-defense, but plenty of evidence exists to refute those claims. For example, Filipino police forces have been found guilty of executing prisoners while in custody. In another instance, an off-duty police officer was caught on camera murdering his neighbor not because of drug use, but because the two were in the midst of an argument. That police officer was arrested. But the majority of officers who have taken unsanctioned violence against the people faced no legal action. In fact, Duterte pledged to protect officers who committed murder in the name of the drug war, vowing that none of them would ever see the inside of a prison cell. The actual number of murder victims in the drug war is difficult to ascertain. The Filipino police claims that there were 6,221 victims. Meanwhile, human rights groups claim that there were 30,000. Some of these victims' families claim that the government got it wrong. These murdered Filipinos were not drug dealers. Duterte's government has even legitimized these claims, admitting that some Filipinos had become collateral damage in the drug war. To justify the death and devastation, Duterte claimed that the Philippines, generally considered a poor country, simply could not afford a national drug rehabilitation program. Thus, he believed that the killings were an appropriate solution until the Philippines had the money to explore other options. Still, the majority of victims killed by both vigilante groups and the state belonged to the Philippines' urban poor, leading many to question whether Duterte's war was with drugs or impoverished Filipinos. Despite this, Duterte remained popular among poor Filipinos. They viewed him as an effective, no-nonsense leader combating an issue that was actively hurting their communities. Rather than being turned off by Duterte's violent language and policies, Filipinos celebrated him for it. After all, there is an argument that Duterte's policies had been working. According to the Philippines National Police, somewhere between 500,000 to 600,000 supposed drug lords surrendered themselves to the Filipino government and were incarcerated. The international community, meanwhile, has attempted to condemn Duterte for the war on drugs, but has been met with much resistance. In 2018, the Philippines announced its intention to withdraw itself from the Rome Statute, which would take them out of the International Criminal Court. By 2019, they were gone. Meanwhile, Duterte told the United Nations not to impose its values on the Philippines, as his government fed the UN's Human Rights Council inaccuracies and misinformation to avert UN scrutiny. This resulted in the UN instituting a Human Rights Council in cooperation with the Duterte government, whereas human rights groups had hoped for an actual investigation into the drug war's killings. It took until 2021 when the ICC finally announced that it was launching an investigation against Duterte for crimes against humanity. Duterte responded by barring the Filipino government from cooperating with the ICC's investigation. The Supreme Court overruled this, deciding that the Philippines were obligated to cooperate with the ICC regardless of the fact that it was no longer a part of it. The ICC dropped the charges 2 months later, but then reopened the case in 2022. By then, the Philippines had a new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. When asked whether or not he would hand Duterte over to the ICC, Marcos replied, "That's a no." Duterte had left office with an 81% net approval rate. His daughter, Sarah, now serves as vice president of the Philippines. Being that the war on drugs is such a young conflict in history, historians are yet to see what the effect will be on the Philippines, especially since, technically, the war on drugs has not ended. The tragedy in the Philippines is larger than one man. It is the culmination of corrupted government, a vulnerable populace, and international law enforcement's inability to exert its influence on an uncooperative state. Moreover, it serves as a reminder that despite improving times in international cooperation, the threat of government overreach is just as alive now as it was at any other point in history.